We are joined this afternoon by Dr. Don Lenihan, a Senior Associate, Policy and Engagement at Canada 2020, Canada's leading independent progressive think tank. Dr. Lenihan is an internationally recognized expert on public engagement, open government, and democracy. Son plus récent livre, Rescuing Policy, The Case for Public Engagement, a été publié en janvier 2012. Il s'agit d'une introduction au domaine de la participation du public, du même qu'un plan directeur pour le changement et un argument soutenu en faveur de la restructuration du processus des politiques publiques. Collaboration and public engagement are central themes in Dr. Lenihan's work. Over the last decade, he has been closely involved in a series of innovative projects, one which was as advisor to the Government of New Brunswick on public engagement in 2007 to 2008, where he developed and ran several pilot projects and helped the government develop its policy on public engagement. He is currently principal advisor on the Government of Ontario's Open Dialogue Initiative, an 18-month project that will use 5 demonstration projects to develop a public engagement framework to guide future use of engagement processes in the Government of Ontario. Please join me in welcoming Don to the podium. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much, Kelly, for the introduction. First of all, and let me thank you all, I'm delighted to be back here. I always like to come back to New Brunswick. I've got a special place in my heart for it, as I'll tell you a tiny bit about in a few minutes. But I just want to give you a sort of brief idea of what I want to do and see how it works for you. As Kelly mentioned, I'm working now, excuse me, I'm working with the Government of Ontario on a pretty ambitious project. We call it the Open Dialogue Initiative, or sometimes the Public Engagement Initiative. And I want to tell you about the initiative, but I really want to talk about the content. Because the content really is, on one level, what is public engagement and what do we need to do? And I want to talk about the sort of basic challenges that we think we're trying to meet. And I think at the same time, it tells us a lot about, in my view, what governments as a whole need to do, not just across this country, but around the world. And I think a lot of that is beginning to happen. I think we are making progress. I've been working at this file for a very long time. I've been saying this for a very long time. But I really do think governments are coming around to this through open government and other things, that engagement, or what I want to call engagement, is an absolutely critical thing, and that it's time we got a lot more, what I would say, methodical or principled about how we do it. And that really is the topic of my talk this afternoon, is what does it mean to get more principled about engagement? Indeed, you may see, making engagement principled. First of all, let me say, Kelly mentioned as well that I came to New Brunswick actually, God, was it 2006? I was here for a year at the request of former Premier Sean Graham. I'd written a book that time on public engagement, and his government had just come to power, and he was really interested in the concept of public engagement. He read my book, and I came out here a few times and talked to him and his staff, and they invited me to come out here for a year and run a public engagement project. And I want to tell you a little bit about this because I want to talk about the history of the project now. In some ways, the project I'm working on in Ontario really started here. I guess it goes further back, but the basic ideas you will see are quite similar, although we're, I think, have made a lot of progress on it. Anybody here remember the self-sufficiency agenda? Yay. Are you self-sufficient yet? That's how we got this conversation going. I remember I got called out here, and they talked about the self-sufficiency agenda. Sounds good. What is it? Well, we're not going to be on equalization anymore. I think that was the only criterion that ever existed for it. But what was great about it for me is it gave me a chance to pitch back to the government what I still very much believe, is that governments need to think much more holistically. They need to think long-term, and that the bottom line is. I think this is now, we should take this for granted, but we didn't even 10 years ago, is that a lot of this has to come from the bottom up. governments can't command this kind of behavior and participation out of citizens and stakeholders. We have to learn how to engage them in a way that allows them to take ownership for a bunch of or a part of the agenda. So that was where we really got started. You want social change, you've got to bring the public into it. It can't be done just from the top down. I'll be brief about this, but I tell you this because you'll see the links with what's happened since in my world and on this initiative, is basically the project that I ran for the government of New Brunswick had 5 pilot projects which were aimed at building awareness and capacity around the idea of public engagement as an approach for government to get the public involved in its agenda of self-sufficiency. Excuse me, sorry folks, I have asthma and it's acting up a little bit. I did a final report which really developed a framework of ideas, some of which I'm going to talk about today, some of which I think remains very much valid, at least in my mind. And in this very room, we launched it with a big national conference in 2008. It was called It's More Than Talk. And the things that we did in there, I think the really important questions were, as you'll see on this list here, help governments decide when to move from what I'll call consultation to dialogue. Decide what kind of dialogue you need to use, because there are different kinds. Decide who you need to engage, and decide what the process should look like. One of the things, I think I had 6 recommendations in that report, and one of the things I recommended to the government at the time, that was the end of my term was when I tabled my report. They liked the framework, and I said, go out and do a demonstration project. One demonstration project which tries to use these concepts here in New Brunswick in a big way, and tries to move the agenda forward. How many of you remember the Poverty Reduction Initiative? Okay, that was the Premier's answer to my report. So I hope you like that. Lots of good things came out of it. It was a hugely ambitious piece of work. I wasn't here then, but it was very interesting to see that they did go on and they did a very ambitious piece of work that they tried to model on the report that I gave them. Now, since then, more recently, I guess about a year and a half ago, and I continued to do a lot of work on this in Canada and other places around the world, developing these ideas that were sort of incubated here in New Brunswick. Premier Kathleen Wynne, before she actually was elected in the last election, invited me to lead a team of 8 people basically on open government. Everybody's heard the phrase open government? And I want to talk just a tiny bit about that. We spent, I think, about 6 months traveling the province and looking around the province, talking to people and looking at these ideas. And what she really wanted to know is, what can we do to make Ontario the most open government in the country? And open government, I don't know if you can see it the same way here, but if you look at the federal government's framework on open government and the government of Ontario, you'll see something like this. There are 3 basic streams in open government. There's so-called open data, open information, and open dialogue. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I do want to say to you is that open data, I think Nora Young was here this morning and probably talked a bit about that. Most of you know. The idea is governments are warehouses full of data. If we shovel this stuff out on the street, it would be very helpful for all kinds of reasons for people to have access to it. It leads to new products and services. It leads to greater transparency and accountability, and so on. It is a public resource that should be made available. Open information, of course, goes way back to access to information. We know a lot about this, whether or not we practice it. And this is part of that triad or 3 streams that should promote open government. The one I'm interested in here is open dialogue. I'm interested in all of them, but what the Premier said to us is this. She said, I realize that there's a lot of work that's been done on open data. The government of Ontario may be behind on this, but don't spend a lot of time reinventing the wheel. We know a lot about that. Tell us what we need to know. And the same thing is true about open information. She said, go out and find out what people think about open dialogue and why we need that to make open government work, and ultimately what we need to do to achieve open dialogue. So that's what most of our report focused on, is what is open dialogue or public engagement, to give it a different name, in the context of open government. So what I want to tell you about now is basically some of the findings from our work, and also where I am now doing this next project, following on the report that we tabled with the Government of Ontario about a year ago or a little over. So why do we need open dialogue to begin with? Or if you like, public engagement, you can use those words in my mind interchangeably. I think there are 2 basic reasons that open dialogue is essential to governments today and that make it really important in a way that were not true, or at least not true to the same degree 30 or 40 years ago, or perhaps even 15 years ago. I've tried to take some nice pictures here thanks very much, to illustrate my points here. So the first one is, if you look at this very busy image here, finding the right solutions can get very complicated. You know what? I'm going to make this real simple. It can get far more complex, and if you want to talk about it in questions and answers, I will. But the bottom line is our world has got a lot more complex. Organizationally, there are far more organizations out there, far more connecting pieces. We think much more holistically. If you're doing policy development, it's not the same exercise it was 20 years ago. You find yourself thinking about all kinds of connections, all kinds of players, all kinds of ways things need to be done. 30 years ago, even 20 years ago, most of that work was and could be done by experts inside the public service. That is to say, there were policy people who could sit down, brainstorm together, think through the issue, and come back with some reasonable proposals and solutions to government on what to do, and the politicians could make the decision. Now, I don't want to say nothing is like that anymore. Lots of things still are. But the bottom line is lots of things are not. Things are so holistically connected in our minds and the way we think about policy that if you start thinking about how do we solve poverty reduction, how do we promote well-being, how do we do economic development, or a whole variety of things, you're going to find out that the connections here, as you already know, are really complex. And the bottom line is we can't make decisions on this simply on the basis of a bit of expertise and so on. A lot of this has to do with choices. If we're going to make a policy, it's not just what does the evidence say. Evidence matters. It's, you know what, we could go 5 different directions here, and we're going to be deciding on priorities, we're going to be trading off values, we're going to be making trade-offs on outcomes. So we can't just sit in a black hole and make this decision and go back out and announce it and expect everybody to like it. There are too many people in different directions that are going to want to go 5 different ways. So the bottom line is we now need the public to make informed choices and legitimate choices in a way that we didn't before. Because if we don't, when you come out and announce that policy, or the minister does, a whole bunch of people are just going to go, how the hell did you get there? Sorry, folks, I'm going to take my watch off because I never know how long I'm talking. In fact, you may have to give me the signal. Loads of time. So the first thing is this, is things can get really complicated. So we need the public essentially in lots of cases, not all the time, but often, to help us make the right choices, and the right means both the best choices and ones that will be legitimate and understood to be legitimate. Secondly, and I think this is the other key reason, is that even if you get the right decision, that is to say, a decision that's perceived as legitimate and perceived as effective, so you come out with the right idea and give it to the minister, and the minister gets up and says, here's what we're going to do. Increasingly, in this interconnected world, it turns out that the solutions that we choose, the solutions we want, are ones that are not deliverable by government alone. The bottom line is if you want to do something like well-being, or let's say something if you're in population health and you want to do reduction of obesity and promote wellness, and you think, geez, the best thing to do is create bicycle paths. Yes, government can create bicycle paths, but guess what? Government can't make people get on their bicycles. They sort of have to do that themselves, thank God. It turns out a whole bunch of the solutions we now think are important in a more holistic world require and bleed over into stakeholder groups, private sector, NGOs, and citizens, and that if they don't help us deliver those solutions, the solutions turn out to be partial, incomplete, and usually ineffective. And that just means on a whole bunch of things, if we want to deliver the solution, if we want to get it right, we need the public not only giving us advice, but actually taking ownership and participating in the plan and decisions to deliver that solution. Those are 2 very big changes in our policy world. A, we need the public to help us make the right choices, and B, we often need the public to deliver those choices. So, what's the problem with how we do engagement now? And I'm going to talk a little bit about this, is, excuse me, I think there are really probably 3 or 4 things here. And the metaphor I often use is the toolbox metaphor. It's a little hackneyed, but I'm going to use it. Sorry, I wish it would. It's my asthma, folks. I apologize for that. So, The trend, here's one of the big problems we have. Let's suppose that we've got a toolbox in terms of engagement processes, and we do. My complaint is that we have a couple of tools in that toolbox, and we tend to use them for everything. You've all heard that expression, if you've only got a hammer, everything looks like a nail. The problem I want to suggest to you, and I'll talk a tiny bit more about this, is that there are, I would argue, in terms of processes for engaging the public, there are 4 basic processes that are fundamentally different. We largely restrict ourselves to 2 or 2.5, and the problem with that is if you want to get a solution, you need to use the right tool with the right problem. And if you end up trying to cut down a tree with a hammer, you probably don't get very far. So the first thing is this: what needs to be in the toolbox of engagement in order to make it work well? But that's not enough. The second thing is this, is even insofar as we have tools in the toolbox, our approach is incredibly ad hoc. It's not principled much at all. Is that if we think, should we do consultation or whatever we're going to call it, largely it falls to a senior public servant or the minister or whoever thinks we should do something. Maybe we should do this, maybe we shouldn't. Some stuff is legislated, but a lot of this is just ad hoc. We don't have any systematic any systematic process for deciding when you need engagement, and so it gets done this way in one department and that way in another. It's largely a matter of style and preference and personal judgment. Some of this is always going to be the case, but my argument would be to you, we need to be a whole lot more principled about how we actually decide when and where we use the tools in the box. Whoops, did I go the wrong way there? Oh, sorry, 3 challenges. Okay, sorry, 3 challenges. So here's what we need to do, and here's what we're trying to do in this framework that we're developing with the Government of Ontario. First of all, we need a full set of tools. I guess I've already said that. We need to identify, and I think I've mentioned to you, there are basically, in my world, I think 4 basic tools. I'm going to give you a little snapshot of what they are in a few minutes. The second thing is matching the right tool with the task. So the framework that we're developing for the Government of Ontario will say there are 4 basic tools and tell the government what they are. It will also provide what I would call a manual, I'm not sure if that's the right metaphor or not, but instructions for essentially how you figure out what tool matches with what problem. This, in my mind, is incredibly important. I've seen this over and over again, and if I had enough time to walk you through this, I would, where I would argue that a lot of the problems we have right now around the lack of legitimacy with consultation processes is because we're using a process, consultation, where in fact it's the wrong tool for the wrong job, and it actually makes the situation worse, not better. So we need to make sure we are matching the right tool with the right process, which we do not do most of the time. We must use the tools well. Even if you have a toolbox with the right tools in it, even if you get the right tool and happen to have the right thing in your hand to do the job, you still have to know how to design a process, how to use the tool effectively, and every circumstance and every problem is different, and that means we do need some rules of thumb, some best practices, some guidance on how we actually design and deliver engagement processes. So there are 3 things here. We need the right tools in the box, we need to know how to match the tool, and we need to know how to use that tool in an effective way. And that's a big part of what we're trying to achieve with this engagement process in Ontario. So the findings of our open government team, the process I told you about last year, basically when we came back to the Premier, here's what we said, is that the current approach to engagement is largely ad hoc, and told her these 3 things. We need basically identify the basic tools, allow us to match the tool, provide guidance on how to use the tool to get the job done. And we recommended in our report, this, if you remember what I said at the beginning about New Brunswick, this is where New Brunswick comes back, is basically the same thing that I did when I was here. Take 5 pilot projects, 5 projects out there, choose them across government, that's what we're doing, identify them well, make them different sorts of projects, and then use those projects to develop the answers to those 3 questions about what's in the toolbox, how do you know when to match the tool, and ultimately, how do you know how to design a process? Let's get systematic and principled about this. Let's see how I'm doing for time here. So let me give you just a little bit more of a snapshot on the toolbox itself. And this is something, when I do my sort of engagement 101, on these slides I would spend usually 2.5 to 3 hours, so you'll excuse me if I do them in 5 or 6 minutes, and you'll be sort of scratching your head, but hopefully if you have questions about them, I'll be happy to answer or respond to some of these in the Q&A. First of all, how many of you in here know what the IAP2 framework is? That's the International Association of Public Participation, and they have a framework for public engagement, which this framework loosely resembles. It's different, and I would just say this for those of you, the benefit of those of you who know IAP2, is this framework of ours is in some ways a modification of the IAP2. It's quite different because I think there are some problems with IAP2, but it was a very good starting point for us over the years in working on this. And rather than walk you through these 4 things, I just want you to see the 4 columns, and I'm going to talk a little bit about each one by individual slides. Those 4 columns are the toolbox. If I had time to walk you through this, I would argue that any public engagement process, from simple consultation to anything more complex that you can give to me, I will show you fits into one of these boxes, and that none of these boxes are the same. They're like 4 fundamentally different games about how public engagement is played with different rules and different purposes, and people's behavior is changed by the particular game you make them play. So if you want them to do a certain thing, you got to give them the right rules and the right process to ensure that they play the game the way they're supposed to, or if you mix up these processes with the wrong problems, you get really weird results. So let me just walk you very quickly through these, the 4 different types. The first one, and this is very much out of the IAP2 framework, I completely agree with this, it's simply information sessions. One thing government can do, one of the process types, is it can give information to the public. All kinds of ways of doing this, but the simplest way, let's just say, is for me to stand up here and impart information to you, the public, about what we're doing or what we plan to do or why we plan to do it. Information, notice, is largely a one-way flow. It's a perfectly fine tool for certain purposes. It's bad for others. Just to give you an example, if people have serious questions on their mind about why you're doing what you're doing, going to launch a new transit system, going to change some other policy, and you go into that room and simply talk at them, what are they likely to do? Anybody? I've had this experience many times. They're going to start yelling at you, right? And all I want to show you there is if you try to use this tool to solve the wrong problem, if people are there to talk about their problems and you try to stick them in this box, you're going to get a bad result. It's fine if they actually are interested in what you're doing and they just want to be informed. So you better make sure you match the right tool with the right process. So information is the simplest form. It's well known. Governments have used it probably since the beginning of time, and we still use it. Excuse me. The second one, which also I think will be very familiar to you, is consultation, or what I would call classic consultation. It has a very simple form, but very powerful, and it's very useful for lots of problems. Consultation looks something like this. Is if you're government, you pose a question to the public because you want to know something about what they think, and you ask the public that question. In stage 1, that I call the views stage, they have an opportunity to express their views to you. You can line them up in a room like this and let them come up to the microphones. You can send out a survey and let them answer a survey letter. You can do any of a wide range of things, but here's what never changes. They are responding to the question you ask them. It's their chance to give you their views. It's their chance to try and influence your decision as a decision maker, and that will matter to them. What happens after they've given you their views, you send them home, and the process turns into an internal process of government. Part 2 is then the rest of us, whoever is running that process, we sit around the boardroom table and we go through all this stuff if we're doing our due diligence, and we try to figure out what are the best arguments, what have we heard here that we haven't heard before, what are the trade-offs we've got to make, what are the conflicts, what are our priorities, what things do we know that they don't know, and we try to do the deliberation over this information to arrive at solutions. And once we have those solutions, we recommend it back to government in whatever form, a report or whatever it may be, with some recommendations about how you actually deliver that solution, and government decides whether or not, how far down that road it's going to be. Notice that the public disappears from this process after stage 1, and the big thinking goes on behind closed doors in stage 2 and stage 3, and the government says, here's what we're going to do. So there's a big gap between what the public says, or when it expresses its views, and when the process reemerges, a lot of things have happened. And this is where sometimes the public's fine about that. I can talk more about that in questions and answers if you want to. But here's what I will tell you, is remember when I said that earlier that one of the things that happens now is there's so much complexity in the world that decisions that we make on policy matters require value trade-offs and all kinds of things. The bottom line is if you now make those kind of decisions behind closed doors, that deliberation thing, and you're making it on a big, hairy problem, the chances are when the minister or whoever comes back out and tries to explain that to the public, a whole bunch of people are just going to go, how did you get there? They don't know how you got there. You can never explain it because there's trade-offs that they could have made differently. And as a result, the process tends to lack legitimacy. It tends to lack explainability, and that makes it oftentimes very bad. If you can explain it simply, and it's not that hard of a problem, consultation may still work. So this is a fine tool as long as you don't find yourself running into that problem of we're going to have to do a whole bunch of trade-offs and other things behind closed doors that a whole bunch of people are going to be mad about when we come back out. Here's what I want you to go through in your mind right now before I flip slides. How do you avoid that problem? If ultimately that deliberation behind closed doors becomes a problem for the public, what is the solution? Actually, we know a lot about this. The solution in principle is fairly straightforward, and it looks like the next step, the third tool, I would call deliberation. And what happens, notice on those lines there that now we've moved the blue line over, and that second stage is now much more out in the open and continues to involve the public. So in a nutshell, the way we solve that problem of lack of transparency, lack of legitimacy, is by saying after the views stage, we don't send the public home. In some important and transparent way, we engage them in the process openly. Open can be spelled out in different ways, where the trade-offs and the assessments and the evaluations are being made by a group of people who are speaking in some important representative sense for the public, so that when you get to the action stage and the government takes this over and starts working, ultimately it's those people are there in a way they can say, we were present, we made these trade-offs, here's a group of us, we look like this and we look a lot like you, your voice was represented there, we can track back for you how this was done. And you can build a lot of transparency into this. So what it really means is that people actually see those trade-offs being made in real time, they understand why and how they were made and by who, and there's a lot more, I would say, legitimacy at the end of the day to the process. There are lots of questions here, which I'd be happy to answer, but that's the basic idea. And finally, if you'll notice in this slide, the last stage, it says government as an orange part as something on itself. You may remember I said there are two things that have changed in our world on engagement. One is the world has gotten way more complex, so that when we try to actually make decisions, if we do it behind closed doors, nobody ever understands how we got to the solution. The second thing that I said is sometimes the solutions are too big for government to deliver. Not always. If it's a regulatory problem and government is the regulator, maybe in this process right here, it's fine for government to go ahead and deliver that solution. But lots of things around well-being, around sustainable development, and a whole bunch of other things, the solutions themselves are bigger than government. And that means that you actually need the public, possibly stakeholders, possibly citizens, possibly other governments, possibly all of the above, involved in that action plan at the end of the day to deliver the solution that you arrived at in that second stage. And when that happens, you need a different kind of process. You have to move the lines, if you like, another step forward. So that what you've got there are views, deliberation, and action in which not only do you have the public engaged in making trade-offs and so on to give it transparency and legitimacy, you have the stakeholders at the table who are involved in and implicated in delivering that solution, and the price they pay for being engaged in that process is they're going to go the whole 9 yards and help you deliver that solution. Why will they do it? Because if they're genuinely stakeholders who have participated in this process, they're involved in the goal as much as you are. Their goals are shared with the government. They're similar goals, and ultimately everybody has an interest in working together around a common framework to achieve the goals. Just about there. So, I guess what I just bring this back to the government of Ontario, and let me kind of sum up by saying this, is that the plan for the framework we're developing, the plan for the framework we're developing there really is to give the government something that will essentially make public engagement government-wide, much more principled, and much more transparent and open. And the framework that I've just outlined for you is the basis of what we think we're doing. And at the end of the day, that framework will be supported by best practices, principles, and ultimately, if you like, a guide, a handbook to how to use that framework to design processes and so on. On the assumption we do this well, this is something that would be adopted by the Government of Ontario as a framework for the government as a whole, based upon those 5 pilot projects, and evolve it further. I guess the last thing I want to say is we're doing a conference we'll begin to announce this and sort of vet some of the early findings in Ottawa, an international conference, looking at the framework as it stands then in, I think, March 31st and April 1st of this year. And there's much international interest in this as well. Is that the open government movement at the international level, the UK, Australia, other countries are very interested in the idea of having a much more robust toolbox and a much more principled approach. My own view is, whether we get it right or not, and I hope we do, or at least better than it is this is the way of the future. We're going to have to crack this nut. If we want the benefits of open government, you can't just shovel data out onto the streets. You've got to have the kind of dialogue processes that turns that data into evidence-based policy and a variety of other things. So we've got to work our way around those 3 streams in open government and make them work together. And in order to do that, we need a much more sophisticated approach to public engagement. So I hope this is in time. I'm going to stop here and open it up for questions and answers and any discussion that you might want to raise. A lot of this is very open-ended. As I said, those 3 or 4 slides I showed you with, I would normally spend a few hours on. So if you feel like you've got a question, you're afraid it sounds like something stupid, there are no stupid questions. It's probably not stupid at all. This should raise lots of questions in your minds.
Can you hear me? Yes.
I can.
I'm wondering how, in your toolkit that you're recommending for the Government of Ontario, how many of those tools are digital tools?
Excellent question. In fact, I would say, first of all, let me say, this may sound surprising, none of them are digital tools. And I think this is really, really important, is all of these projects are, not only are we responsible to use interesting processes, mainly deliberation and collaboration, because we know a lot about consultation and information sharing. We don't need more expensive than them. But what the tools do, the online tools, is they are much more sophisticated. They're part of that how-to box, right? Remember the 3 questions? Well, what's in my toolbox? How do I know which tool to use? And the tool is the process, folks. The tool is not a digital thing, it's a process. And you can use digital tools to deliver a process or to support a face-to-face process. Processes tend to be either face-to-face or digital or some combination. My best guess is right now we're mainly still doing, when we get to real discussions, you need a lot of face-to-face. We're getting better at digital stuff. That's part of the if you like, we want to move that forward. And 10 years from now, if everything goes well, we will be way more sophisticated at doing this online, and we won't need nearly as much face-to-face. So it's a great question.
In my first question this morning, I invoked the TV show House to help deliver the question. Now I'm going to invoke the movie Hoffa.
Huh? Jack Nicholson.
In the movie Hoffa, at one point, Jimmy Hoffa is at a rally, and one of his colleagues is on stage trying to rally the troops. And he sort of makes this comment with a lot of resentment in his voice that says, he knows the lyrics, but he doesn't know the music. I see the government talking a lot about these kinds of things, and I argue that they may know the lyrics, but they don't know the music. How do you make government know the music of deliberation, collaboration, open government, and so on, beyond just the tools?
Yeah, well, first of all, let me tell you, I've spent, if you were watching my slides, you'll see that more or less the process we're now doing in Ontario, as I've candidly admitted, looks a lot like the one I did here 10 years ago in New Brunswick. You may wonder what happened. Where did it go? It's a good question. We can talk about that. What I will tell you is I've spent the last 15 years increasingly trying to convince senior public administrators across this land and around the world, and particularly here in Canada at all 3 levels of government, the political level, to buy into this stuff. Here's my sort of short version of the answer to your question. You remember the 2 things that I said have changed? One is that the more complex our choices are, the harder it is for the politicians ever to explain back to the public how they made the decision they made. And we see this all over the place, right? I don't know how many of you guys know the Gateway Pipeline debate that went on. And they had 3 commissioners go out, this pipeline that was going to run from Alberta to BC. And they had 3 commissioners go out and travel across Alberta and BC and hold consultations, right? It was consultations about should we run the pipeline. Well, you know, you got issues about Aboriginal rights, you got issues about, obviously, the affected areas and the wildlife, you got issues about financial development, issues about impact on communities, and a zillion issues I can't even think of. As you can imagine, 3 people sitting there listening to all this, right? Virtually every policy space in the world is implicated by what's going on, going back into behind closed doors, figuring out the answer to the question, why should we or should we not do this pipeline, and then coming out and explaining all those trade-offs, say, to Aboriginal people. Well, here's how we traded off your historical, your cultural rights against our interest in financial development or something. All this to say, politicians now know this, is that they hate consultation because it puts them more and more in this box. And I think the problem there is we're essentially using the process to try and answer a question that it no longer answers. It creates worse problems for them because it robs the decision of legitimacy, and now they're left trying to explain to everybody, how do we get this answer? So my first answer is, as they come to know that, what you've got to show them and convince them is, you know what, there's a better way to do this. You don't have enough tools in your box, and if we actually did this differently, it would solve this problem for you rather than making it worse. You would actually find out people cohere and agree around a solution rather than not. Now, there's a lot of things you may sort of say is, really? That's a longer conversation, trust me. I've done lots of processes. I could demonstrate some of that to you. We get better at it as the time goes on. But my short answer is this, is we want effectiveness and legitimacy in our processes. Increasingly, we're losing it. And that as we begin to examine how we lose effectiveness and how we lose legitimacy, these processes begin to provide us the answer with how you can actually reintroduce that in the process. But it does require that we make some changes about how we do things. And there are other questions there that I could touch on, and I'll see if anybody else has any questions. If they don't, I'll come back to it. Is that enough of an answer for the moment? Okay. Others? I could talk about that one all day.
This may be fairly basic. We've all seen the consultation, and I guess my question is from the citizen's perspective. Consultation, I get to voice my opinion on your ideas and tell you everything that's wrong with them, typically, as you just mentioned. Collaboration, I can picture that, your example of the bicycle path, and now I'm committing to participate. Help me understand a little bit better about what the citizen's signing up for in a deliberation type of exercise.
For deliberation as opposed to collaboration?
Yes, the middle piece.
Well, yeah, I would just say this, is take, let's think of a good example. Well, a good example, I think, is regulatory change. You know, it may well be that regulations on, let's go to a municipal level and imagine that you are, in fact, wanting to develop some kind of policies around climate change and the environment, right? And you're going to do some regulatory changes to how things work, how people dispose of garbage. I mean, very simple examples, black box, blue box, green box, all that sort of stuff, which is things that government ultimately delivers on its own in the sense that it creates regulations, it changes the regulatory framework. But it may be that if it does a whole bunch of this stuff on its own, depends how sophisticated we get, a whole bunch of people sort of go, what the hell has that got to do with anything? If you bring them into it, first of all, you get their experience. They may actually tell you a whole bunch of things you did not know about bicycle paths or bicycle lanes or whatever it is in a municipality. And bringing them into the discussion not only helps you find things you didn't know and didn't anticipate and test your own ideas against them, it also creates legitimacy, and that if at the end of the day you arrive at a reasonable level of agreement and compromise between the people at the table, when you launch that new program or regulatory framework, they're way more inclined to accept it, and you've got people who are champions for it. So I think, just to summarize that, there are lots of decisions where lived experience and a number of voices to explore possible implications in an interconnected world that is complicated becomes a huge advantage for getting it right. And that doesn't mean they always have to deliver it. Lots of times government can. But it doesn't mean government knows what to do. Others? Wide open, folks. Let me, there's a question there.
Hi, so you've made these recommendations and defined these different tool sets. How do you teach government, which knows pretty well how to do the consultation parts, to get to collaboration?
Well, first of all, let me say this, is I think in some ways, tongue-in-cheek, partly tongue-in-cheek, I say governments don't know how to do consultation very well. And the best evidence is they keep trying to use it. If you knew how to use a hammer well, you wouldn't try to cut a tree down with it. It turns out that governments, when they are in the right place, when there are nails in front of them, they do know how to hammer a nail. So that's okay. What they really aren't very good at is telling the difference between a nail and a tree, if I can use that metaphor. So to go back to the rest of the question, how do we get them there? I think this goes back to the other question here, is I think you have to show them, and we're getting, I think, much more sophisticated about this, and governments are getting much more experienced at this. You have to show them, A, the world has changed. It's changed in two ways. It's more complex, and now we actually can't deliver all our own solutions that people expect us to deliver. The promises we're making are bigger than us, and we talk that way now. We talk about well-being. No government can deliver well-being. We talk about sustainable development. No government can deliver sustainable development on its own. So we got to show them that the outcomes that we are committing, our discussion is based on outcomes that are bigger than us, and we're committing to bigger policy objectives. And the tools we have for getting us there don't get us there. And not only do they not get us there, they're making it worse. We can point to lots of cases, examples, where we say, you know what went wrong here? Let's back up and let's walk through this, and I'll show you what went wrong and why, ultimately, you lost people's trust, why they got angry at you, why they did all the things they did. Now let's try in a simple, let's go into the laboratory, let's get a petri dish, and let's try something simple and see if we can do it a little differently and a little better. Let's do some pilot projects, and let's see if we make progress. Nothing succeeds like success. And I will tell you, I've run since the time I've been in New Brunswick, I have run many pilot projects of different sorts, some of them not so good. Some of them have failed kind of miserably. But we get better at it, and in fact, what we see now, I just finished a consultation project in Ontario about a year ago, which was the renewal of the Condominium Act. There are 1.3 million people in Ontario living in condominiums. There are 600,000 condominium units. There are 68,000 condominium corporations. This involves consumer protection, finances, building, a whole bunch of very complex areas. And people really care about their condominiums. When we started that process over 18 months, there was no agreement among stakeholders and even less among the owners. By the time we went through that complex project, and it was very complex, I have a case study in this I'd be happy to share with you. At the end of the day, our final report had 40 pages of recommendations, over 100 recommendations, from big, broad ones to very technical ones. We had them sign off on every recommendation there, all the people involved in the group. It's now before the legislature as a piece of legislation, about to go through third reading, and all of the stakeholders are on side. And we did that with the process.
So in your pilot projects, what does collaboration actually look like?
It depends on the project, but I can give you an example. One of them, I probably shouldn't be saying this, but because nobody here from Ontario, we haven't officially announced them yet, although I don't think it's a big secret. One of them will be on community policing or community security. So a good collaboration example here is the government wants to do across the province community plans in every community, or at least the major communities, for security. And share appropriately a lot of the responsibility for community security beyond the police with other stakeholders and citizens. So how do you actually create a process that not only comes up with a plan that's appropriate to the community, but where the community buys into it at those various levels and helps deliver it? So one of them will be on essentially making sure we've got the right process to make that happen. And you can't tell people what their plan is going to be. You can't tell them they have to abide by it. It's got to be their plan, they got to own it, and they got to believe it's right, and they got to want to make their community secure. So you have to go to the motivational level and give them the opportunity to realize this really matters to us. We want our communities to be safe. And the process can do that. The process can do that. Or if you do it wrong, it can frustrate it, right? You can put people in a position where they feel like they're boxed in by the process, and they may start feeling like you're manipulating them, you're cheating them, you're hiding things, you're lying, whatever it may be, and then the process goes south.
Thank you.
Sorry, I'm full of questions. One of the big obstacles and barriers to open data that I keep hearing from government is actually the issue of security and privacy. That seems to be the sort of the go-to, no, we can't response to implementing an open data plan. What's your typical response to that concern?
Sorry, I'm not sure I got the question again.
The security and privacy issue of instituting open government, open data, having a much more collaborative sort of experience and so on. There's always a big concern about security and, you know, privacy concerns and things along
Well,
those
let me just say this. The first, this is a great question, a longer, much longer one, but I'll give you my sort of brief version of this. First of all, I mean, there's at least 3 things that I think are really important in open data and open information for that matter: security, privacy, and I would say proprietary rights. There are such a thing as proprietary rights for corporations and things like that on their patents, et cetera, that matter. I would also say this, is that the culture of government, please don't take offense anybody, is enormously secretive, right? We've just built up that culture over 30 or 40 or 50 years. It's gotten worse over the last 15 or 20, and we now tend to think we're so, what's the word I'm looking for? We're so, I think a lot of this has to do with the processes. We've had so many bad experiences with being open, or we think we're open, and it comes back in our face. We now think the only way to get through things is to manage them very carefully and very secretively and so on. Here's my short answer to this, and I think the processes are part of the key to the solution of this is, yes, there is privacy concerns, yes, there are security concerns, yes, there are proprietary ones, but they are not nearly as robust as most of the people in government seem to think, or lots of them, and that we would find out under the right circumstances, if we start to open up the culture, that it will force you to change as a bureaucrat how you do what you do. But my argument is that's not a reason for saying it's wrong. That may be a reason for saying you've created a culture and a set of practices that are way more secretive than they need to be to get where we need to go. So where is the appropriate line for privacy? There's no simple answer to that conclusion, but there are better and worse answers. And I think almost anybody who looks at this for very long starts saying, I'm not sure exactly where it is, but it's a long way from where we are. We're way more concerned with secrecy than we need to be. And if we actually we're forced to think through that, open by default. If we just said to governments, you know what, and I'm firmly committed to this, we're not just going to ask you guys to move along a little bit. We're going to tell you now, we're going to stand you on your head. The principle is no longer with information and data that if you think that it's okay to release it, you can. It's going to be just the reverse, is you have to release it, you should release it, unless you got an explanation for why you're not. And I do think that's the fundamental cultural shift that we need to go through, is open by default on information, on data, and I would argue on dialogue, by which I mean, that's why we need a principled framework, is you don't just in an ad hoc way get to decide when do we have a conversation. There should be a principled basis so that we decide we are open for engagement and discussion when ultimately the principles that we stand by demand that. And a good framework will give you that direction. So the short answer is we're just way too overpriced on security and all those sort of things. And the worst thing about it is in the current context, we're likely to get worse, not better, if we don't pay attention. Any further things, folks? Happy? Any questions at all? I'd be happy to get any feedback in a minute or two that remains, right? Yes? About 5? Let me ask you a question. How many of you think that engagement, sort of somewhere along the lines that I'm talking about, or you do, really is important for the future, that we need to open this up and we need more tools? Anybody? Anybody want to come up and tell us a bit about that? Take a shot at it? Tell us what you're doing, or what I've got wrong? If you said yes, come and tell us something about what you think needs to be done that isn't being done now. Anybody? Come on.
We had a talk about someone who's working with the fishing industry, and he's a scientist. And he says we need more data from people who are fishing. We need to know where all the fishing boats are going, because the fishing industry and the policy around it was working off models that were incorrect. And that's why we're seeing some catchments completely disappear. So we need to get more data and have it, and also listen to the scientists more, because there's a systematic failure of not listening to them and making the wrong policy.
Excellent. And I want to note just the little connection you made at the end, because I think this is really important and easily overlooked. You said we need more data, and I forget how you said it, but an input from the scientists, or however you put it. Notice that what you're doing there in a very intuitive way is you're linking the use of data with dialogue. And I think we really got to take notice of this. There's a myth circulating out there in the open data world that if you just shovel a lot of data onto the street, it will get used. You know what, folks? Not necessarily true. There may be a little bit in some people who will use it. If we want to use that data and use it well, we need sophisticated processes of different sorts for different purposes that massages, transforms, and figures out how to put that data to work for us. That's a dialogue question. Anyway, thank you very much. Anybody else? Yes.
The example that I've been thinking about and that I've been talking about with any number of people recently has been the federal government's response to the Syrian refugee crisis and how the absorption of a bunch of newcomers to Canada across the country is going to require a collaborative effort, not only from governments to governments, but all levels of government, and service clubs, and churches, and community groups, and anybody who is living anywhere within the vicinity of the arrival of this group of people. And it is intriguing to me because I keep thinking that there's got to be some sort of, I don't know, magic website or something that's going to pop up that people will be notified, okay, there's some people arriving here, we have a child with special needs, and one service club will jump in and say, okay, we can get you your wheelchair and your ramp. And then it'll be another group that says, okay, well, we've got lots of winter boots for kids. And because the actual practical needs have to be addressed quickly and responsibly and without a bunch of extra stuff attached to it. Just people helping people.
It's a terrific example. I think it's absolutely true. And in fact, let me go a little bit beyond that and say not only do you need to engage the public, if you're Justin Trudeau and you're going to bring in 25,000 refugees over the next 6 weeks or for all I know 6 months, all of those things that you're talking about are going to be true, is those people are going to have to be brought into homes, integrated into communities, taught to speak English, and a whole bunch of things that it's going to go way beyond governments can to be able to do. And here's an interesting thing that somebody pointed out to me about that the other day is, if you look at the government, and I'm not trying to plumb for or against any government, but just think about this kind of initiative, is whether they realize it or not, and I think they do, is they can only do this initiative, as if you're saying, is if they genuinely believe, A, they are doing collaboration and collaboration is possible, and they are implicitly or explicitly asking Canadians to play their part in this. And they are. They're out there saying, we need communities, we need people to take them in our homes, we can't do this ourselves. It's a folksy, colloquial way of putting it. What they're really saying is we recognize this is a collaborative process, and we're taking the chance that if we call on Canadians to rise to the occasion, they will. And I think they will. If, as a leader, you don't believe they will, what kind of policy are you likely to have? You're not going to be bringing 25,000 people in over 6 weeks or 8 weeks or whatever it is. You're going to be saying that's the last thing on earth we can do, because what are we going to do with them when we get here? Again, folks, I don't want to plumb from one side or the other. All I want to tell you is how you answer that question, what you believe about our ability to engage Canadians and get them to do stuff, it will determine your policy on that. Because if you don't think you can do that, you're not going to be bringing in 25,000 refugees. If you do, you bloody well better get it together. I have 1 minute left, folks, so I'm just going to take a second to say, I guess one last thing is, excuse me, I did talk about one metaphor, the toolbox. There's one other metaphor I want to use quickly here. I think it's really important. I've alluded to the games. If you've ever gone in and sat down when people are playing cards or some game at the table, and you don't know the game and they ask you to play, just think about this. What's the first thing you do? The two things you want to know is, what are the rules and how do I win? And if they change the game, and you don't know what the next game is, you're going to ask the same question all over. When we get into a game, the rules and our expectations are determined by the rules, and the rules shape our behavior in the game. These four processes are different because they are fundamentally different sets of rules for how we work together. They are different in kind, and that we need to be clear on what makes them different so that when people come into those processes, we can make it clear to them what rules they're playing by, and their behavior will be more consistent with that. Right now, half the time people are left guessing at what game they're playing because we aren't very clear about it. And that means nobody's really sure how the process is working. We've got to get way more clear about that. Folks, thank you very much. I hope this has been useful for you. I appreciate very much having had the time to talk.
Thank you, Dr. Lenihan. acknowledge your attendance here today. I'll see if I can get through this without knocking stuff over. I'd like to present you with a little token of appreciation.
Thank you very
on
much,
behalf
Kelly.
of the organizing committee. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We're now ready to segue into our second concurrent panel. So for those of you who will be attending the presentation in the governor's room, you'll have the opportunity to hear the experience of 8 panelists leading research teams titled Research Co-Creation as Citizen Engagement. For those of you who are choosing to stay in this room, we will be hearing panelists speaking about data and self-determination.